Maggie's hand hovered over the security button beneath the reception desk, her nursing instincts warring with something she couldn't name. The stranger stood just inside the entrance, melting snow pooling at his feet on the scuffed linoleum. His clothes were threadbare but clean, a faded flannel shirt beneath a jacket that had seen too many winters, work boots that spoke of honest labor. But it was his hands that caught her attention as he brushed the snow away, calloused and scarred, the hands of someone who built things, fixed things. "Sir, visiting hours ended at 9, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "If you're having a medical emergency—" "I'm not." He stepped closer, and she caught the faint scent of sawdust and something else. Pine, maybe, or cedar. But storms like this, they bring people together for a reason. Outside, the wind shrieked against the windows with renewed fury. The lights flickered, and somewhere in the building's depths, a generator hummed to life. Half of Clearwater had already lost power, according to the radio crackling behind her. Emergency services were overwhelmed, roads impassable. It would be just her and whatever casualties the storm delivered until morning. "What's your name?" she asked. "David." He smiled, and something in her chest loosened, a knot she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. "And you're Margaret. But people call you Maggie." She blinked. "How did you—" But before she could finish the question, the automatic doors burst open again, bringing a gust of Arctic air and 2 paramedics struggling with a stretcher. "Hypothermia case!" the lead EMT shouted over the wind. "Found her in her car in the ditch on Route 7. Elderly female, unconscious, core temp dangerously low." Training took over. Maggie rushed toward them, her questions about the stranger forgotten as they wheeled the patient into Trauma Bay 1. The woman was blue-white, her breathing shallow, pulse thready. Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store. Maggie recognized her despite the hypothermia's ravages. "Get me heated blankets and startin' 4 with warm saline," Maggie called to the EMTs, then remembered she was alone. Dr. Reyes wouldn't make it in until the roads cleared, if then. She was it. "I'll get the blankets." She spun around. David had followed them into the trauma bay, was already moving toward the warming cabinet with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. She should have stopped him. Patients' families weren't allowed in treatment areas, let alone random strangers. But Mrs. Henderson's lips were turning grey, and protocol seemed less important than saving a life. "Are you medical?" she asked, as he handed her the heated blankets. "I've had some experience." His voice was steady, calm. "Her circulation's compromised. You'll need to rewarm slowly to avoid cardiac shock." Maggie nodded, wrapping Mrs. Henderson carefully. "The 4 kits in the second drawer, left cabinet." David was already there, movements efficient and practiced. 18 gauge, considering her dehydration. For the next 40 minutes, they worked in synchronized silence. David seemed to anticipate her every need, adjusting monitors, checking vitals, preparing medications she requested before she asked for them. Gradually, Mrs. Henderson's color improved, her breathing deepened. When the old woman's eyes finally fluttered open, Maggie felt the familiar rush of victory over death. "Where am I?" Mrs. Henderson whispered. "St. Mary's," Maggie said, checking her pulse. "You're going to be fine." Mrs. Henderson's gaze drifted to David, standing quietly in the corner. "Thank you, young man. You have your father's gentle touch." David smiled but said nothing. Mrs. Henderson closed her eyes, drifting into natural sleep now instead of unconsciousness. "I need to call this in," Maggie said, stepping into the hallway. But when she returned 5 minutes later, David was sitting beside Mrs. Henderson's bed, one scarred hand resting gently on her forehead. The monitors showed vital signs stronger than they had any right to be. "She'll sleep peacefully now," he said simply. Maggie stared at the readouts. Mrs. Henderson's core temperature had risen faster than medically possible. Her heart rate was steady, blood pressure normal. In 30 years of nursing, Maggie had never seen someone recover from severe hypothermia so quickly. "Who are you?" she asked again. David stood, and for a moment, in the harsh fluorescent light, his features seemed to shimmer. as if she were seeing him through water or from a great distance. But then he was solid again, real, watching her with those ancient eyes that held such infinite sadness and infinite love. "Someone who understands what it means to lose people you're trying to save," he said quietly. The words hit her like a physical blow. 3 years of buried guilt rose in her throat, the weight of failure she carried every day. The homeless man's face flashed in her memory, the same eyes, she realized with a start, the same depth of understanding, but that was impossible. The doors opened again, wind howling, and David moved toward the sound. More patients were coming. The next wave of patients crashed over them like the storm itself. A family of 4 whose car had slid off Highway 2, a rancher with a suspected heart attack, 2 teenagers suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning after running their car for heat in a closed garage. For 3 hours, Maggie moved through the chaos with David beside her, and somehow everything that should have gone wrong didn't. The rancher's cardiac episode stabilized without the defibrillator she couldn't locate in the dark supply room. The teenagers' oxygen saturation improved faster than their blood work suggested possible. The family's various injuries, a broken wrist, a concussion, severe lacerations, all responded to treatment, as if their bodies were eager to heal. By 4 in the morning, the emergency department had settled into an exhausted quiet. David sat in the break room, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she'd made him, while Maggie finished her charting. Through the small window, she could see the storm beginning to exhaust itself, the snow falling more gently now. This was her life, had been for 30 years. Night shifts at St. Mary's, the only hospital serving 3 counties of ranchers, farmers, and small-town families who couldn't afford to be sick anywhere else. She'd started here fresh out of nursing school, young and idealistic, believing she could save everyone. Marriage to Tom had come and gone in her 30s. "You love this place more than me," he'd said, and he'd been right. Her work was all she had left. Usually, that felt like enough. She thought of her apartment across town, dark and empty. Frozen dinners in the freezer, crime novels stacked beside an unmade bed, the coffee maker set to brew at 3 p.m. for when she woke up to do it all again. Her sister Karen called from Seattle every few weeks, voice bright with updates about her children's soccer games and school plays, always ending with the same invitation: "You should come visit, Maggie, get out of that place." As if leaving were that simple. What would she tell Karen about tonight? That a stranger had appeared in a snowstorm and somehow made her remember why she'd become a nurse in the first place? That for the first time in 3 years, she'd worked through a shift without the crushing weight of failure pressing against her chest. She couldn't explain the homeless man who'd died Christmas Eve 2020. James Morrison. She'd learned his name afterward, too late to matter. 43 years old, a carpenter who'd lost everything to addiction and pride. He'd come in hypothermic, just like Mrs. Henderson tonight, but something had gone wrong. The rewarming had triggered cardiac arrest, and despite 40 minutes of CPR, despite calling every code available, despite pouring her 30 years of experience into keeping him alive, he'd slipped away. On Christmas morning, while families across Clearwater opened presents and shared breakfast, she'd sat in this same break room and wondered if she'd chosen wrong. Every decision, every medication, every desperate attempt to restart his heart. The coroner had ruled it accidental death, complications from exposure and chronic health issues. "Nothing you could have done differently," Dr. Reyes had told her. But Maggie knew better. She'd hesitated on the epinephrine dosage. She'd been distracted by the Christmas carols playing in the hallway, by thoughts of the shift ending, by her own loneliness, instead of focusing completely on saving a life. 3 years, and she could still see his eyes. Brown and deep and somehow familiar, as if she'd known him before he came through those doors. He'd tried to speak just before the cardiac arrest, reached for her hand with fingers stained by sawdust and work. But she'd been too busy checking monitors to listen. "You're thinking about him again." She looked up. David stood in the doorway, coffee cup empty in his hands. His voice was gentle, without judgment. "I don't know what you mean. The man you couldn't save. The one who haunts your nights." Maggie's pen slipped from her fingers. "How could you possibly—" "Because I've been where you are." David moved closer, settling into the chair across from her, carrying the weight of every loss, forgetting every life you've helped. It's a heavy burden for one person to bear. "It's my job," she said quietly. "I signed up for this. Did you sign up for the guilt? For the sleepless days wondering what you could have done differently?" She stared at him, this stranger who seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed walls. "Who are you really, David?" He smiled, that same gentle expression that had first made her lower her guard. "Someone who knows that healing works both ways. The healer needs healing too." Outside, the storm was dying. Soon the roads would clear and the regular day shift would arrive. Dr. Reyes would return, other nurses would clock in, and the emergency department would buzz with normal activity. David would leave, they always did, the patients and families who passed through her life for a few hours before moving on to whatever came next. The thought of being alone again felt unbearable. "Please don't leave me tonight." The words slipped out before Maggie could stop them, raw and desperate in the fluorescent-lit break room. She immediately felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I mean, until the day shift arrives. In case more patients." "I wasn't planning to go anywhere," David said softly. Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by embarrassment. In 30 years of nursing, she'd never asked anyone to stay, not Tom, during the worst of their marriage when the silence at home felt suffocating, not Karen, during those brief visits when her sister would hover awkwardly around the hospital, clearly counting the hours until her flight back to Seattle. Maggie O'Sullivan didn't ask for help, didn't admit to needing anyone. But something about this night, about him, had stripped away her defenses. "The roads will be clear by 6, she said, trying to regain her professional composure. "The county crews are good about getting to the hospital first." David nodded, but his eyes never left her face. "What was his name?" "The man you lost." The question hit like ice water. James Morrison. She'd never said his name aloud to another person, had carried it silently for 3 years like a stone in her chest. He was a carpenter, homeless. Came in Christmas Eve with severe hypothermia. "Tell me what happened." And somehow, she did. The words poured out of her in the pre-dawn darkness, how James had been found behind the Lutheran church, how his core temperature had been dangerously low, how everything had seemed under control until it wasn't. She told David about the cardiac arrest, the failed resuscitation, the way James's eyes had searched her face in those final conscious moments, as if he'd been trying to tell her something important. "I keep thinking if I'd listened to him instead of focusing on the monitors," she said. "He was trying to speak, reaching for my hand, but I was so worried about his vitals that I—" Her voice cracked. "Maybe he was trying to tell me something that would have helped. Maybe if I'd just stopped and listened." "You did everything right," David said with quiet certainty. "You don't know that. You weren't there." Something flickered across his face, an expression too quick to read. "Sometimes people die not because we fail them, but because their time has come. That doesn't make their death meaningless or your efforts worthless." "It feels worthless." The admission came out in a whisper. "Every night since then, every patient I couldn't save completely. Mrs. Henley's stroke last month left her paralyzed. Tommy Garrett's overdose caused brain damage. I start to wonder if I'm losing my edge, if I should have retired years ago instead of staying here pretending I can still—" "Look at tonight," David interrupted gently. "Mrs. Henderson is alive because of you. That family from the highway, the rancher, those teenagers, all alive because you were here, because you knew exactly what to do. You helped with all of those cases. I couldn't have managed alone." "You weren't alone." His voice carried an odd weight, as if the words meant more than they seemed. "You're never as alone as you think you are." Before Maggie could ask what he meant, the emergency department's main alarm began blaring, not the patient call button but the hospital-wide emergency signal. Her stomach dropped. She'd heard that alarm only 3 times in her career, during the tornado in 2015, the plant explosion in 2018, and the multi-car pileup that had overwhelmed their trauma capacity. They rushed to the main desk where the radio was crackling with urgent transmissions. "St. Mary's, this is Clearwater Emergency Dispatch. We have a mass casualty incident developing. Amtrak 47 eastbound has derailed approximately 4 miles west of town. Early reports suggest 20 to 30 injured, multiple serious. All available emergency personnel are requested, but road conditions are preventing most first responders from reaching the scene. ETA for ambulance transport is unknown." Maggie's hands went cold. A train derailment with 30 casualties, and she was the only medical staff in the building. Dr. Reyes lived 15 miles out. He'd never make it through the snow in time. The nearest trauma center was 2 hours away in good weather. "Dispatch, this is St. Mary's," she said into the radio. "We're operating with minimal staff due to the storm. I have 1 RN on duty and—" She paused, glancing at David. "Limited resources." "Copy that, St. Mary's. Ambulances will transport as they're able. Prepare for multiple hypothermia, trauma, and potential spinal injuries." Maggie set down the radio with shaking hands. 30 people, possibly dying, and she was all that stood between them and death. The homeless man's face flashed in her memory. James Morrison, whose life she'd been unable to save despite every effort. She turned to David, saw him watching her with those ancient eyes that seemed to hold infinite understanding. "I can't do this alone," she whispered. "You won't be," he said simply, and something in his voice made her believe him. The weight of David's promise hung in the air between them, but as the minutes ticked by, doubt crept through Maggie's chest like ice water. She stood frozen at the nurse's station, staring at the radio that would soon crackle with updates from the derailment scene. 30 casualties, maybe more, and she was supposed to save them all? Her hands trembled as she pulled up the hospital's emergency protocols on the computer. Mass casualty procedures she'd memorized, but never hoped to use alone. Triage guidelines that assumed multiple doctors, a full nursing staff, adequate resources. Not one exhausted night shift nurse, and a mysterious stranger who claimed he could help. "I should call Dr. Martinez in Billings," she said, more to herself than to David, "or see if they can divert some patients to Great Falls. This is too much for you." David's voice was gentle but challenging. "For anyone." The words came out sharper than she intended. "I'm not a trauma surgeon. I'm not equipped for multiple spinal injuries, potential internal bleeding, complex fractures. These people need more than I can give them." The familiar spiral of doubt began its descent. How many times had she second-guessed herself since James Morrison died? Every difficult case became a reminder of her limitations, every split-second decision haunted by the possibility of error. She'd started questioning instincts that had served her for 3 decades, hesitating when decisive action was needed. David moved closer, his presence somehow both calming and unsettling. "What's the alternative, Maggie? Turn them away?" "Of course not." She pulled up the supply inventory, scrolling through their dwindling stock. "But look at this. We're low on blood products. The ultrasound machine's been acting up, and if we lose power completely—" Her voice trailed off as she thought about the generator. It could handle basic lighting and essential equipment, but not everything they might need. Not the kind of comprehensive care that 30 trauma patients deserved. "I killed someone 3 years ago," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "Not on purpose, but through my failure, my hesitation, my inability to see what needed to be done. What if I do it again? What if my doubt gets people killed tonight?" The admission hung between them like a physical thing. She'd never spoken it aloud before, this certainty that James Morrison's death was her fault. Dr. Reyes had argued otherwise. The coroner's report had cleared her, but Maggie knew the truth that lived in her chest every day. "Tell me about the moment," David said quietly. "The exact moment you think you failed him." Maggie closed her eyes, transported back to that Christmas Eve. He was stable. Rewarming was going according to protocol. Then his heart rhythm started changing. Subtle at first, just some irregular beats. I had maybe 30 seconds to decide: conservative approach with monitoring or aggressive intervention with medication that could cause complications. She could see it so clearly. James Morrison's face, peaceful despite his condition, his eyes tracking her movements around the room. He'd been trying to speak, his lips forming words she couldn't quite catch over the hum of medical equipment. I hesitated, she continued, just for a few seconds, weighing the options. And in that hesitation, he went into full cardiac arrest. If I'd acted immediately, pushed the epinephrine without second-guessing myself. "You might have triggered the arrest earlier," David said, "or caused complications that would have killed him faster. You can't know, but I should know." Frustration edged her voice. 30 years of experience should have taught me to trust my instincts, to act decisively. Instead, I froze. "And now you're telling me I can handle 30% casualties when I couldn't even save one homeless man?" The storm outside was calming, but Maggie felt a different kind of tempest building in her chest. The old fears, the crushing weight of inadequacy she'd carried since that Christmas morning. What if her hesitation tonight cost multiple lives? What if families lost loved ones because Margaret O'Sullivan wasn't skilled enough, wasn't decisive enough, wasn't enough? "I need to call for backup," she said, reaching for the phone. "Life Flight, other hospitals, anyone who can—" David's hand covered hers on the receiver, stopping her motion. His skin was warm, calloused from work she couldn't identify. "What did James Morrison tell you, in those moments when you thought he was trying to speak?" "I don't know. I wasn't listening properly. I was too focused on—" She stopped, confusion flooding through her. "How do you know he was trying to speak? I never mentioned that to you." David's eyes held hers, ancient and knowing, infinitely sad. "What do you think he was trying to say?" The question pierced through her defenses, straight to the truth she'd buried for 3 years. "That it wasn't my fault," she whispered. "That he was ready. That sometimes, despite everything we do, people's time comes, and we have to let them go with grace instead of fighting until the very end. And if that's true, then maybe I didn't fail him." The possibility felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Maybe I gave him comfort in his final moments instead of just medical intervention. Maybe that was enough. Outside, the first ambulance sirens began wailing in the distance, growing closer through the snow. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the pre-dawn quiet like a blade. Maggie's hand remained frozen under David's, the phone receiver halfway to her ear as the weight of realization settled over her. Maybe that was enough. The words echoed in her mind, challenging 3 years of self-recrimination. "They're coming," she whispered, watching red and blue lights pierce the darkness beyond the windows. The first ambulance was fighting through the snow, its progress slow but determined. David released her hand and stepped back, but his eyes never left her face. "So what will you choose, Maggie?" The question hung between them as the ambulance pulled into the emergency bay. She could see the paramedics moving urgently in the back, their patient invisible behind tinted glass. Behind them, another set of lights appeared in the distance. Then another. Her mind raced through the possibilities. She could stick to protocol, call for backup that might not arrive for hours, transfer patients to hospitals that were already overwhelmed, follow procedures designed for adequate staffing and ideal conditions. It would be safe, defensible. No one could blame her for following the rules. Or she could do what James Morrison had been trying to tell her that Christmas night. Trust herself. Trust her 30 years of experience. Trust that sometimes being present and determined was enough, even when circumstances weren't perfect. The emergency bay doors burst open, and paramedic Jake Rodriguez wheeled in their first patient, a woman in her 50s, conscious but with obvious arm fractures and possible internal injuries. "Maggie, thank God you're here," Jake called out, his usual calm cracked by urgency. "This is Sarah Chen, passenger from car 2, vitals stable, but she's got abdominal pain and this compound fracture. We've got 6 more in the first wave, 3 critical." Maggie looked at the woman on the gurney, frightened, injured, trusting that St. Mary's could help her. Then she looked at David, who stood quietly in the corner, his presence somehow radiating the same strange calm she'd felt all night. The old Maggie would have immediately started explaining limitations, preparing excuses for why she couldn't provide optimal care. But as Sarah Chen's eyes met hers, something shifted inside her chest. The crushing weight of James Morrison's death didn't disappear, it transformed into something else. Purpose, determination, the fierce protectiveness that had driven her to become a nurse in the first place. "Get her to Trauma 1, Maggie said, her voice steady and sure. "Jake, what's the status on the others?" "Mix of hypothermia, fractures, and head injuries. 2 potential spinal cases coming in the next wave. The worst is a guy who got pinned, possible internal bleeding, unconscious. 6 patients, then more. Each one depending on her judgment, her skills, her ability to make life or death decisions without second-guessing herself into paralysis." Maggie moved to Sarah Chen's bedside, her hands already assessing injuries with practiced efficiency. "Sarah, I'm Maggie, your nurse. Can you tell me where it hurts?" As she worked, checking pupils, palpating for internal bleeding, stabilizing the fracture, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Flow, the seamless integration of knowledge, instinct, and compassion that had once made her one of the best emergency nurses in Montana. Her movements were sure, her decisions quick and decisive. "Possible splenic injury," she told David quietly, as she prepared for access. "She needs imaging, but the portable X-ray is our best option until the road's clear." David nodded, moving to help without being asked. His hands were gentle as he positioned Sarah for the X-ray, his voice soothing as he explained each step. Watching him work, Maggie felt the last of her hesitation fall away. The emergency bay doors opened again. 2 more gurneys, 3 more lives depending on her ability to prioritize and act. In the distance, she could see more ambulances fighting through the snow. "Maggie!" David's voice was quiet, meant only for her. "You know what to do." She looked around the emergency department. Her domain for 30 years, the place where she'd saved countless lives and lost precious few. Tonight would test everything she'd learned, everything she'd become. But for the first time since James Morrison died, she wasn't afraid of that test. "Trauma 2 and 3, she called to Jake as he brought in the next patients. "And get me an inventory of our blood supply. We're going to need everything we have." The controlled chaos of emergency medicine began to unfold around her. Radio updates from the scene, medical equipment humming to life, the steady rhythm of assessment and treatment that had shaped her adult life. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, Maggie felt something she'd almost forgotten, the quiet confidence of someone who belonged exactly where they were. She caught David's eye across the room as he helped position another patient. His slight smile confirmed what she already knew. There was no going back now. She'd crossed some invisible threshold, stepped away from 3 years of doubt and into the unknown territory of trusting herself again. The night ahead would be long and difficult. People might die despite her best efforts, but she would not hesitate. The next hour tested every assumption Maggie had about her limitations. The patients kept coming. A steady stream of broken bodies pulled from the twisted wreckage of Amtrak 47. A teenage girl with a concussion and possible spinal injury, an elderly man whose chest compressions had cracked 3 ribs but saved his life. A mother clutching her infant, both miraculously unharmed but in shock. Each case demanded split-second decisions, and to her amazement, Maggie found herself making them without the paralyzing doubt that had haunted her for 3 years. But it was the arrival of Marcus Webb that changed everything. Jake wheeled him in just after 4 a.m., his face grim. 42-year-old male, found pinned under debris. Possible internal bleeding, blood pressure dropping, unconscious for the last 10 minutes. Maggie took one look at Marcus and knew they were in trouble. His pallor spoke of significant blood loss, his breathing shallow and rapid. This wasn't a case she could manage with basic emergency protocols. He needed surgery, blood transfusions, resources she simply didn't have. "We need to transfer him," she said. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew it was impossible. The storm had worsened again, and the roads were impassable. "Get me Dr. Reyes on the phone." "Already tried," Jake replied. "Phone lines are down in his area. Cell towers, too." Maggie stared at Marcus Webb's unconscious form, feeling the familiar spiral of panic beginning. This was exactly the kind of case that terrified her. Complex, critical, requiring expertise beyond her scope of practice. 3 years ago, she would have attempted treatment with confidence. Now, all she could think about was James Morrison's face as he slipped away despite her efforts. "His blood pressure's dropping," David observed quietly from beside the gurney. Somehow he'd materialized there, his hands already moving to check pulse points with disturbing familiarity. "I know." Maggie's voice was tight. "But I can't operate. I can't fix whatever's bleeding inside him. All I can do is stabilize and hope." "Hope for what?" David's eyes met hers. "For someone else to save him? Or hope that you remember who you are?" The challenge in his voice sparked something defensive in her chest. "I remember exactly who I am. I'm a nurse, not a surgeon. There are protocols, limitations, legal boundaries I can't cross." "Whose protocols?" David asked. "Whose limitations?" Before she could answer, Marcus Webb went into cardiac arrest. The monitor's alarm shrieked as his heart rhythm flatlined. Maggie's hands moved automatically, starting compressions while Jake prepared the defibrillator. But even as she worked, doubt flooded her mind. Was she pushing hard enough? Should she have intubated first? Were her compression rates correct, or was she remembering outdated guidelines? "Come on," she whispered, counting compressions. But the voice in her head was louder. "You're going to lose him, just like James Morrison. You're going to fail again." "Maggie," David's voice cut through her internal spiral. "Stop listening to the fear." She looked up from Marcus's chest, her hands still pumping. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." His eyes were ancient, knowing. "You've been practicing medicine for 30 years, but for the last 3, you've been practicing fear. Which voice are you going to trust tonight?" The defibrillator charged. Maggie called clear and delivered the shock. Marcus's body convulsed, then settled back into unconsciousness. The monitor showed sinus rhythm, weak but present. "He's back," Jake breathed. But Maggie knew it was temporary. Whatever was bleeding inside Marcus would kill him unless she did something drastic, something beyond her comfort zone, something that required the kind of decisive action she'd been second-guessing for 3 years. "I need to open him up," she said suddenly. The words surprised even her. Jake stared. "Maggie, you can't." "I can." The certainty in her voice was startling. "I've assisted on dozens of exploratory surgeries. I know the anatomy, I know the procedures, and he'll die if I don't try." It was David who brought her the surgical kit from the supply closet. David who helped position the overhead lights. David whose steady presence anchored her as she broke every protocol she'd ever followed. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something she'd almost forgotten, the crystalline clarity that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done. "Talk me through this," she whispered to David as she made the initial incision. "You already know," he replied. "Trust what you know." And somehow, impossibly, she did. Her hands moved with confidence she hadn't felt in years, finding the source of bleeding, controlling it, stabilizing what could be stabilized. She lost herself in the work, in the pure focus of fighting for a life that hung in the balance. When Marcus Webb's blood pressure finally stabilized 20 minutes later, Maggie looked up to find David watching her with something that might have been pride. "How did you know I could do that?" she asked. David's smile was gentle, mysterious. "Because I know who you really are, Maggie O'Sullivan, even when you've forgotten." The surgical instruments felt foreign in her hands as Maggie set them aside, the adrenaline of the emergency surgery slowly fading into something more complex. Marcus Webb's breathing had steadied, his color improving with each passing minute, but the weight of what she'd just done was beginning to settle over her like a physical thing. "Jake, I need you to monitor him every 5 minutes," she said, stripping off her bloody gloves. "Any change in vitals, any sign of complications, you call me immediately." Jake nodded, but his expression was troubled. "Maggie, what we just did, if the state board finds out, if the hospital administration—" "I know." She cut him off before he could voice the fears already circling her mind like vultures. Professional censure, possible criminal charges, the end of her career, but Marcus Webb was alive, and that had to count for something. The emergency bay doors opened again, and 2 more paramedics wheeled in another patient, a woman in her 30s with obvious head trauma. Behind them, Maggie could see at least 3 more ambulances lined up in the snow, their red and blue lights painting the storm in violent colors. "This is Maria Santos," the lead paramedic called out. "Possible skull fracture, unconscious for the last 20 minutes, Glasgow coma scale of 6. Maggie looked at the woman on the gurney, then at Jake's worried face, then at the line of ambulances still waiting outside. The temporary confidence she'd felt during Marcus Webb's surgery began to crack at the edges. One emergency procedure was a desperate necessity. But this, managing multiple critical cases, making decisions that could affect dozens of lives, this was something else entirely. "We're in over our heads," she whispered to David as they moved Maria to Trauma 2. "One lucky save doesn't make me a trauma surgeon. What happens when the next case goes wrong? What happens when I make a mistake that kills someone?" David was quiet for a moment, helping her position the patient for examination. "What happens if you don't try?" The question hung between them as Maggie began her assessment. Maria's pupils were unequal, responding sluggishly to light, signs of increased intracranial pressure. In a fully equipped trauma center, she'd need immediate imaging, possible neurosurgical intervention. Here, with limited resources and no backup, Maggie felt the familiar paralysis beginning to creep back in. "I can't operate on her brain," she said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. "There are limits, David, real, physical limits to what I can do." "Are there?" His voice was maddeningly calm. "Or are there just limits to what you believe you can do?" Before she could respond, Jake's voice cut across the room. "Maggie, Marcus is going into shock again. Blood pressure's crashing." She rushed back to Trauma 1, her mind racing. The surgery had been successful, but something was going wrong. Internal bleeding she'd missed? Surgical complications? As she worked to stabilize Marcus's pressure, pushing medications and fluids, she felt the crushing weight of inadequacy pressing down on her again. "This is what I was afraid of," she muttered, adjusting 4 drips with hands that trembled slightly. "One complication leads to another. I should have transferred him when I had the chance." "To where?" David asked. "The hospital in Billings that's already overwhelmed? The trauma center in Great Falls that's 3 hours away on a good day?" He was right, but that didn't make the responsibility any easier to bear. More patients were arriving. She could hear the radio chatter, the urgent voices of paramedics coordinating with dispatch. Each one would be looking to her for answers, for the kind of confident medical care that could mean the difference between life and death. The old fears were back now, whispering their familiar poison. "You're not qualified for this. You're going to kill someone. You should have stayed in your lane, followed protocols, accepted your limitations." But then Maria Santos opened her eyes. It was just for a moment, a flutter of consciousness that most people would have missed. But Maggie caught it, and in that brief connection between patient and nurse, she saw something that stopped her spiral of self-doubt cold. Trust. This woman, injured and vulnerable and completely dependent on strangers, was trusting Maggie to fight for her life. "Did you see that?" she asked David. "I saw you seeing it," he replied. "The moment when you remembered why you became a nurse in the first place." The monitors around them beeped and hummed, marking the steady progress of healing bodies. Marcus Webb's pressure was stabilizing again. Maria Santos showed signs of increasing alertness, Outside, more ambulances waited in the snow, carrying more people who would depend on her decisions in the hours ahead. Maggie took a deep breath, feeling something fundamental shift inside her chest. The fear wasn't gone. It probably never would be completely, but it was no longer in control. "We're going to need more supplies," she said to Jake, her voice steady again. "And I want you to set up triage in the main hallway. We're going to save as many as we can." David smiled, and for the first time since he'd arrived, Maggie thought she glimpsed something infinite behind his ancient eyes. The glimpse of infinity in David's eyes should have unsettled her, but there was no time for questions. The emergency bay doors exploded open with a violence that shook the building, and suddenly Maggie's carefully constructed moment of confidence shattered like glass against concrete. "We've got multiple criticals." Jake's voice cracked with strain as he backed through the doors, pulling the first gurney. The second car, it was worse than we thought. Train car shifted during extraction. "We've got a family of 5, all critical." Behind him came a parade of horror that made everything they'd handled so far look like practice rounds. A man in his 40s, conscious but with obvious spinal damage, his legs motionless. A woman clutching a toddler, both covered in blood from sources Maggie couldn't immediately identify. Twin boys, maybe 8 years old, one unconscious, the other screaming for his mother in Spanish. And still they kept coming. "Where do you want them?" another paramedic called out, wheeling in an elderly woman whose breathing was so labored Maggie could hear it across the room. The emergency department that had felt manageable moments before suddenly seemed impossibly small. Every trauma bay was occupied, monitors beeping in a discordant symphony of medical crises, and still more ambulances were pulling up outside. Through the windows, Maggie could see the red and blue lights stretching into the distance like a macabre Christmas display. "Triage Protocol 7, she called out, her voice automatic even as her mind reeled, walking wounded to the waiting area. "Criticals to trauma bays 1 through 4. Jake, get me an ETA on." She stopped mid-sentence as her eyes landed on the unconscious twin. Something about his stillness, the particular way his small body lay motionless on the gurney, sent ice through her veins. It was James Morrison all over again. That same quality of hovering between worlds, life hanging by threads so thin they might snap at any moment. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible over the chaos around her. David appeared at her elbow, his presence solid in the swirling madness. "What is it?" "I can't." The confession escaped before she could stop it. "Look at them all, David. Look what's happening. This isn't about confidence or trusting myself anymore. This is about the simple mathematical reality that I cannot save them all." She gestured wildly at the scene around them. Marcus Webb, still touch and go from his surgery. Maria Santos, showing signs of consciousness but needing constant monitoring. The spinal injury case, who might be paralyzed for life if she made one wrong decision about stabilization. The toddler whose blood loss she couldn't assess properly while his mother held him. The twins, one of whom might already be slipping away while she stood there drowning in her own inadequacy. 30 years of experience doesn't matter when you're facing 20 patients and you're only one person, she continued, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. All those pretty speeches about trusting myself. What good is trust when the physics of the situation makes failure inevitable? The unconscious twin's monitor chose that moment to alarm. Bradycardia. His heart rate was dropping, oxygen saturation falling. Maggie looked at him, then at his conscious brother, who was calling his name in increasingly frantic tones, then at the growing line of ambulances outside. This was it. This was the moment she'd been dreading for 3 years. Not just one life hanging in the balance, but multiple lives, each demanding immediate attention she couldn't possibly provide simultaneously. The crushing weight of impossible choices, of having to decide whose life was worth the most effort, whose chance of survival justified the allocation of her limited time and resources. 20 patients, she repeated, the words coming out like a death sentence. 20 patients, and I'm going to have to choose which ones to let die. The twins' alarm grew more insistent, his brother's cries more desperate. In the trauma bay behind her, Marcus Webb's vitals showed signs of stress that might indicate internal complications from the surgery she'd performed. Maria Santos was moving restlessly, possibly developing increased intracranial pressure that could kill her in minutes. "This is what James Morrison was trying to tell me that Christmas night," Maggie said, her voice hollow with realization. "Not that I should trust myself more, that I should accept the reality of what I can't control. Some people die, no matter what you do. Some nights a lot of people die." She looked at David, expecting to see disappointment or that mysterious knowing smile he'd worn earlier. Instead, his expression was completely serious, ancient eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights like deep water. "Yes," he said simply, "some people die, but not tonight." Before she could ask what he meant, he moved toward the unconscious twin, his carpenter's hands already reaching for the boy's pulse points. And in that moment, as chaos swirled around them and impossible choices loomed like executioners' axes, Maggie realized her ordeal was just beginning. Maggie watched David approach the unconscious twin, his carpenter's hands moving with that same inexplicable certainty she'd witnessed all night. But as his fingers found the boy's pulse points, something went terribly wrong. The child's monitor flatlined with a piercing shriek that cut through the chaos like a scream. "No!" The conscious twin's cry was raw, animal, a sound that would haunt her forever. "Miguel! Miguel, wake up!" Maggie rushed to the bedside, her hands moving automatically to begin resuscitation. But even as she started compressions on the small chest, she could feel the truth settling over her like ice water. The boy was gone. Despite David's promise, despite everything she'd believed about this strange night, Miguel was slipping away under her hands. "Come on," she whispered, pushing rhythmically on ribs that felt fragile as bird bones. "Come on, sweetheart, come back to us." But the monitor remained flat, indifferent to her efforts. Behind her, she could hear other alarms beginning to sound, a cascade of medical crises that demanded immediate attention. Marcus Webb's blood pressure was dropping again. The elderly woman's breathing had become labored to the point of respiratory failure. The toddler in his mother's arms was showing signs of shock. "Maggie," Jake's voice was urgent, "I need you. The spinal case is going into distress." She looked up from Miguel's still form to see David standing perfectly motionless beside the bed, his face etched with something she'd never seen there before, uncertainty. For the first time since he'd walked through those doors, he looked entirely, completely human. "I don't understand," he whispered, his hands still resting on the boy's forehead. "This wasn't supposed to happen." The words hit Maggie like physical blows. All night she'd begun to believe that David was something more than he appeared, that his presence somehow guaranteed the impossible outcomes she'd witnessed. Marcus Webb's successful surgery, Maria Santos's improvement, the steady stream of patients who defied her expectations by surviving when they shouldn't have. But Miguel was dead, and David looked as lost as she felt. "Maggie," Jake's call was desperate now. "I'm losing the spinal case." She had to choose. Continue working on a child who showed no signs of life, or abandon him to try to save someone who still had a chance. The mathematics of triage were brutal and clear. But as she looked down at Miguel's peaceful face, she felt something fundamental breaking inside her chest. This was James Morrison, all over again, but worse. At least 3 years ago, she'd only had one life to lose. Tonight, surrounded by the wreckage of her newfound confidence, she was watching her failures multiply like cancer cells. "Time of death," she started to say, then stopped. The words wouldn't come. Across the room, she could see the spinal patient's monitor showing dangerous arrhythmias. The elderly woman was turning blue. The toddler had gone limp in his mother's arms. "I can't do this," she said, backing away from Miguel's bed. "I can't keep choosing who lives and who dies. I can't keep pretending I'm something I'm not." David reached for her arm, but she pulled away. The gesture that had comforted her all night now felt like a lie. A false promise from someone who was as powerless as she was. "You said they wouldn't die tonight," she accused, her voice breaking. You stood there and told me that some people die but not tonight, and now this child is dead because I believed you. Because I wasted precious seconds listening to promises you couldn't keep. Maggie, please." She was moving toward the door now, past the chaos of patients she couldn't save, past Jake's desperate attempts to manage cases that needed a full trauma team, past the waiting room full of families who trusted her to perform miracles she'd never been capable of. I should have called for helicopter evacuation hours ago. I should have closed the emergency department and transferred everyone to Billings. I should have followed protocols instead of playing God. The automatic doors opened into the storm, and the cold hit her like a slap. Behind her, alarms were sounding from multiple monitors. Jake was calling her name, and David was saying something she couldn't hear over the wind. But all she could think about was Miguel's still face and the terrible certainty that she'd let her pride and desperation lead her into the same trap that had haunted her for 3 years. She'd failed again. But this time, it wasn't just one homeless man on Christmas Eve. This time, she was failing an entire community that had no one else to turn to, and the weight of that failure was crushing her into something smaller and more broken than she'd ever been. The snow swirled around her as she stood in the parking lot, watching more ambulances arrive through the blizzard, carrying more lives she wouldn't be able to save. And for the first time since David had walked into her emergency room, Maggie O'Sullivan felt completely, utterly alone. The cold was absolute, cutting through her scrubs like they were tissue paper, but Maggie barely felt it. She stood in the parking lot, watching the ambulance lights paint the snow red and blue, each pulse a reminder of another life she couldn't save, another family she'd have to face with empty hands and hollow words about doing everything possible. The weight of Miguel's still form seemed to press against her chest with every breath. 8 years old, the same age as her nephew Tommy back in Seattle, the boy whose birthday cards she sent religiously because she was too afraid to visit, too afraid to get close to another child who might need her to be more than she was capable of being. Behind her, through the glass doors, she could see David standing exactly where she'd left him. He wasn't moving, wasn't trying to follow her or call her back, just standing there beside Miguel's bed like a statue, his carpenter's hands useless at his sides. The sight of him, this stranger who'd somehow convinced her she could be something more than a small-town nurse drowning in her own limitations, filled her with a rage so pure it almost warmed her. 30 years, she whispered to the storm. 30 years of believing I was helping people, and what do I have to show for it? A dead homeless man on Christmas Eve and now a dead child, because I was too proud to admit I wasn't enough. The emergency bay doors opened again, and Jake appeared, his face frantic in the red light of the ambulances. "Maggie, where are you going? I need you in here." She almost laughed. Need. As if her presence had ever been anything but a liability when it mattered most. As if the patients arriving in those ambulances wouldn't be better served by someone who understood their own limitations, someone who followed protocols instead of chasing impossible dreams of redemption. "Call Billings," she called back to him, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Get everyone transferred, close the department, do what I should have done hours ago." But even as she said it, she knew it was too late. The storm had worsened, visibility down to nothing. No helicopters would fly in this weather, and the roads were becoming impassable. The people in those ambulances were trapped here with her, dependent on a nurse who'd just proven she couldn't handle the responsibility. Jake started toward her, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Just go. Save who you can. Don't waste time trying to fix me." She turned away from the hospital, away from the lights and the chaos and the crushing weight of expectation. The parking lot stretched before her like a frozen wasteland, cars buried under drifts that made them look like sleeping animals. Her own Subaru was somewhere among them, probably unreachable now, not that it mattered. Where would she go? Back to her empty apartment to stare at the walls and count her failures? Back to the routine of predictable shifts where the most challenging decision was which pain medication to administer? The snow crunched under her feet as she walked deeper into the storm. With each step, the hospital lights grew dimmer behind her, the sounds of crisis more muted. She should go back, she knew that. Jake was probably drowning in there, trying to manage cases that required a full medical team. But the thought of walking back through those doors, of seeing Miguel's covered form and David's disappointed face and all those other patients she'd inevitably fail, it was unbearable. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Jake, "Please come back. David says he knows what happened to Miguel." She stared at the screen through the swirling snow, her thumb hovering over the keys. What could David possibly know that would matter now? What explanation could justify a child's death? Could make her abandonment of her post anything other than the cowardice it was? Another buzz, another message. "It's not what you think." The wind howled around her, driving snow into her eyes until tears froze on her cheeks. In the distance, she could hear sirens, more ambulances fighting their way through the storm, carrying more lives that would depend on decisions she wasn't qualified to make. The sound should have sent her running back to help, but instead it made her want to walk deeper into the white emptiness until she disappeared entirely. But then something made her turn around. Not Jake's texts, or the sirens, or even her own sense of duty. It was simpler than that, more fundamental, the realization that running into the storm wouldn't change anything. Miguel would still be dead, James Morrison would still be dead, and somewhere behind those glass doors, David was waiting with an explanation that might be the only truth she had left. Her feet were numb by the time she reached the entrance, her scrubs soaked through with snow. Through the glass she could see David exactly where she'd left him, but something was different now. He was looking directly at her, those ancient eyes holding something she couldn't name. Recognition, maybe, or forgiveness. As her hand touched the door handle, Maggie realized she was about to learn something that would change everything she thought she knew about guilt, redemption, and the mysterious stranger who'd walked into her life on the worst night of the year. The warmth of the hospital hit Maggie like a wall as she stepped through the doors, her soaked scrubs clinging to her skin. The chaos she'd left behind had transformed into something else entirely, not the frantic energy of medical crisis, but a strange, expectant quiet that made her footsteps echo against the linoleum. David hadn't moved from Miguel's bedside, but as she approached, she could see that everything had changed. The boy's chest was rising and falling in steady rhythm. The monitor displayed a strong, regular heartbeat. Miguel's eyes were open, dark and alert, tracking the movements of his twin brother who was crying. Not from grief now, but from overwhelming relief. "How?" The word escaped Maggie's lips as barely a whisper. David turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before, a weight, as if he'd paid some invisible price for the miracle she was witnessing. "You had to see it," he said quietly. "You had to experience the full weight of what you thought was failure before you could understand what's really happening here." Maggie moved closer to Miguel's bed, her medical training automatically assessing his condition. Pupils reactive, skin color good, vitals stable. By every measure that mattered, this child should still be dead. But he wasn't. He was smiling weakly at his brother, trying to form words around the oxygen mask covering his small face. "You'll let me believe he was gone," she said, the accusation hanging between them like smoke. "His heart stopped," David replied. For 3 minutes and 47 seconds, Miguel Santos was clinically dead, just like James Morrison was 3 years ago. The mention of James's name sent ice through her veins. Don't you dare use his death to justify some kind of—" James Morrison lived for 4 minutes after his heart stopped. David's voice was gentle but implacable. 4 minutes where you performed perfect CPR, where you made exactly the right decisions, where you fought for his life with everything you had. 4 minutes where you were the only thing standing between him and complete darkness. Maggie shook her head, backing away from the bed. "He died. I failed to save him." "You didn't fail to save him, Maggie. You succeeded in giving him 4 more minutes." David stepped closer, his carpenter's hands open at his sides. 4 minutes where he wasn't alone. 4 minutes where someone cared enough to fight for him when everyone else had given up. 4 minutes where love was the only medicine that mattered. Around them, the emergency department had found its rhythm again. Jake was efficiently managing the other patients, their conditions stabilizing one by one in ways that defied explanation. But Maggie's focus was entirely on David's words, on the impossible idea that her greatest failure might have been something else entirely. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Look around you," David said. "Look at what you've accomplished tonight. Marcus Webb, alive because you trusted your surgical instincts. Maria Santos, recovering because you recognized the signs others missed. The spinal injury case, stable because you made the right call about immobilization. 23 patients have come through these doors tonight, and 23 patients will go home to their families. Because of you," Maggie protested. "Because of whatever you are, whatever impossible thing is happening here." David shook his head slowly. "I can't heal anyone, Maggie. I never could. All I can do is help people see what they're truly capable of when they stop being afraid of their own humanity." The words settled over her like a blanket, warm and heavy with possibility. She thought about the night's events, not just the miraculous recoveries, but her own growing confidence, the way her hands had moved with certainty during Marcus's surgery, the intuitive diagnoses that had felt like revelations. "The fear," she said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. "The fear is what's been killing them, not my inexperience or the lack of resources. The fear itself. Fear makes hands shake during procedures," David confirmed. "Fear makes doctors second-guess critical decisions. Fear makes nurses hesitate when seconds matter. You've spent 3 years practicing medicine while carrying the weight of James Morrison's death, and that fear has been like a poison in everything you touch." Miguel reached up weakly and pulled the oxygen mask aside. "Gracias," he whispered, his young voice barely audible but clear. Maggie felt something shift inside her chest. Not the breaking she'd experienced in the parking lot, but a reconstruction, pieces of herself finding their proper places for the first time in years. She looked around the emergency department with new eyes, seeing not the impossible challenges that had overwhelmed her, but the steady competence with which she and Jake had managed each crisis. "What happens now?" she asked David. He smiled, that mysterious expression she'd grown to recognize throughout the long night. "Now you continue doing what you've always done, but without the fear, without the crushing weight of believing you have to be perfect to be worthy." Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the wind's howl diminishing to a whisper. Dawn was still hours away, but something fundamental had changed in the quality of the darkness. Maggie felt it in her bones, not hope exactly, but something more solid, purpose maybe, or simply the quiet confidence that comes from finally understanding your own strength. For the first time in 3 years, she was ready to be exactly who she was, Maggie O'Sullivan, night nurse, keeper of the watch, guardian of the space between darkness and dawn. The automatic doors burst open again, bringing with them a gust of snow and 2 paramedics wheeling in what looked like the night's most serious case yet. The patient was a middle-aged woman, unconscious, her face ashen in a way that made Maggie's newly found confidence waver for just a moment. "MVA about 6 miles out," the lead paramedic called as they rushed toward the trauma bay. Sarah Chen, 42, lost control on black ice. Possible internal bleeding, BP dropping fast. "We've been trying to reach Billings for airlift, but—" "The storm," Maggie finished. Already moving alongside the gurney, the familiar weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders, but this time it felt different. Not crushing, but substantial. Real. "Jake, I need you to prep for emergency surgery." As they transferred Sarah to the trauma bed, Maggie caught a glimpse of David in her peripheral vision. He was helping Miguel's family gather their belongings, speaking quietly with the boy's mother in what sounded like flawless Spanish. For a moment, their eyes met across the emergency department, and he nodded. Not the encouraging gesture of someone offering false hope, but the acknowledgement of one professional to another, someone who trusted her to do what needed to be done. Sarah's vitals were declining rapidly. Internal bleeding, definitely, and without proper surgical facilities, without a full trauma team, the odds were stacked impossibly against them. 3 years ago, Maggie would have felt the familiar spiral of panic, the crushing certainty that she was about to fail another family on another terrible night. Now, she felt something else entirely, the clear-headed focus that comes from accepting responsibility without drowning in it. "Jake, I need you to assist," she said, her voice steady as she began her examination. "And call the blood bank. Tell them we're going to need everything they have on hand." As they worked, more patients continued to arrive, casualties of the storm and the treacherous roads it had created. A teenage driver with a concussion, an elderly man who'd fallen on ice and broken his hip, a woman in labor whose contractions had started during the power outage. Each case presented its own challenges, its own impossible demands on their limited resources. But something had fundamentally changed in how Maggie approached each decision. Instead of being paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong choice, she found herself trusting the 3 decades of experience that had brought her to this moment. When she had to prioritize the internal bleeding over the broken hip, she did it with the clear understanding that this was triage, not abandonment. When she had to make split-second decisions about Sarah's emergency surgery, her hands moved with the competence that had always been there, buried under layers of self-doubt. "Pressure's stabilizing," Jake reported, his voice tinged with something that might have been amazement. Maggie looked up from the surgical site to see David standing near the doorway, no longer helping with individual patients but simply observing. There was something different about his presence now, less mystical, more human, as if whatever impossible thing had been sustaining him throughout the night was beginning to fade with the approaching dawn. "You're leaving," she said, not really a question. He stepped closer, careful not to interfere with the ongoing surgery. "My work here is finished." "Your work was never the healing, was it?" Maggie continued suturing, her hands steady even as understanding bloomed in her chest. "You were just here to help me remember who I am." "You never forgot," David replied quietly. "You just convinced yourself that James Morrison's death erased everything good you'd ever accomplished. But tonight, when it mattered most, you saved every life that could be saved. Just like you've been doing for 30 years. Sarah's breathing was growing stronger, her color improving with each passing minute. Around them, the emergency department hummed with organized efficiency, Jake monitoring the other patients, families reuniting with loved ones who would recover, the steady rhythm of a medical team that knew exactly what it was doing. "What about James?" Maggie asked, the question she'd been carrying for 3 years finally finding voice. "Was there really nothing I could have done?" David was quiet for a long moment, and when she looked up, she saw something in his ancient eyes that took her breath away. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the infinite compassion of someone who understood loss in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. "James Morrison died knowing he wasn't alone," he said finally. "In his last moments, he was surrounded by people who cared about him, who fought for his life with everything they had. You gave him dignity when the world had taken everything else away. You gave him love when he needed it most." The words settled into the deepest places of her guilt, not erasing the pain but transforming it into something she could finally carry. Sarah's surgery was nearly complete, her vitals strong and stable. Dawn was beginning to touch the eastern windows, and with it the certain knowledge that Maggie O'Sullivan was exactly who she had always been, a healer, a guardian, a woman who would never stop fighting for the lives placed in her care. The final confrontation with her own limitations had become something else entirely, not a battle to be won, but a truth to be accepted and transformed into strength. But as Maggie secured the final suture on Sarah's abdomen, the automatic doors exploded open with a violence that made everyone in the emergency department freeze. The paramedics who rushed in weren't moving with their usual controlled urgency. They were running, their faces masks of barely controlled terror. "Mass casualty event," the lead paramedic shouted, his voice cracking. Tour bus went off the mountain highway, 43 passengers, mostly kids from a church group. "We've got multiple traumatic injuries, several DOAs and more coming in every minute." Maggie's hands stilled over Sarah's surgical site. 43 patients, most of them children, with only her, Jake, and whatever mysterious presence David represented, in a rural hospital with limited blood supply, no trauma team, and equipment that belonged in a museum. This wasn't just a test of everything she'd learned tonight. This was an impossibility disguised as a medical emergency. "Ite?" she asked, her voice somehow steady even as her mind raced through the mathematical impossibility of what they were facing. First wave in 3 minutes. Critical injuries coming first. Jake appeared at her shoulder, his face pale but determined. "Maggie, we can't handle this. We need to call for backup. Evacuate to Billings." "Nothing's moving in this storm," she cut him off, turning to look at David. But something was wrong. The mysterious stranger who had guided them through the night's miracles was leaning heavily against the wall, his face drawn with exhaustion that seemed to go beyond the physical. Whatever force had sustained him was ebbing away like water through cupped hands. "I can't," David said quietly, his ancient eyes meeting hers with something that looked like an apology. "Not for this. This is yours alone." The weight of those words settled on her like a physical force. Everything tonight had been preparation for this moment. Miguel's resurrection, Sarah's successful surgery, the gradual stripping away of her fear and self-doubt. But 43 patients? Children whose lives would depend entirely on decisions made by a night nurse who 3 hours ago had been ready to walk into a snowstorm and disappear? The first ambulance arrived before she could fully process the impossibility of what was coming. The paramedics burst through the doors carrying a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, her body broken in ways that made Maggie's surgical training feel like finger painting. Behind them came another gurney, and another, each carrying injuries that would challenge a full trauma center. "Jake, triage protocol now," Maggie commanded, moving toward the first patient. "Anyone who can wait goes to the waiting room. Critical cases get priority based on survivability, not sentiment." But as she began her examination of the teenage girl, she realized that everything she'd learned about emergency medicine, about managing multiple casualties, about making impossible choices under pressure, was inadequate for what lay before them. The girl had multiple internal injuries, possible spinal trauma, and was losing blood faster than they could replace it. Under normal circumstances, she would be a candidate for immediate airlift to a major trauma center. Tonight, Maggie was the major trauma center. More patients kept arriving. A 12-year-old boy with a head injury that required immediate intervention, twin sisters with crushing injuries to their legs, an adult chaperone whose chest had been crushed by the bus's collapsing roof. Each case demanded immediate attention, resources they didn't have, expertise that didn't exist in this small hospital. Maggie found herself moving between patients with a clarity that transcended panic. Not because she wasn't afraid, the fear was there, sharp and clean and immediate, but because she had finally learned to work with it instead of being paralyzed by it. When she had to choose between stabilizing the head injury or attempting surgery on the girl with internal bleeding, she made the decision based on 30 years of experience, not 3 years of guilt. "Maggie," Jake called from across the department, his voice tight with strain. "I've got 2 more criticals coming in, and we're out of O-negative blood." She looked up from the 12-year-old boy whose skull fracture she was stabilizing to see David watching from the doorway. His presence had diminished to almost human proportions now. The mysterious authority that had guided them through the night reduced to something that looked like profound exhaustion. But his eyes still held that ancient compassion, and when he nodded at her, she understood. This was the test, not whether she could save every life. That had never been the true measure of her worth. The test was whether she could face the ultimate impossibility without losing herself in it, whether she could be fully present for the children who might die and the children who might live, and know that her best effort was enough, regardless of the outcome. As the next wave of ambulances arrived, Maggie O'Sullivan stepped forward to meet them, carrying everything she'd learned in 30 years of healing and 1 night of revelation. The next wave brought the worst cases yet. A 10-year-old girl whose chest rose and fell with the mechanical irregularity of punctured lungs. A teenage boy whose spine had been compressed in ways that made Jake turn away. An adult chaperone whose pulse was so weak it barely registered on the monitors. Maggie stood in the center of the emergency department, surrounded by more suffering than she had ever faced in a single night, and felt the familiar presence of her old enemy rising to meet her. Not David, who remained slumped against the wall like a fading echo of divine intervention. Her real antagonist had always been herself, the voice that whispered she wasn't good enough, smart enough, strong enough to deserve the trust placed in her hands. "You can't save them all," the voice said with cruel certainty. "You couldn't save James Morrison, and you can't save these children. You're just a night nurse in a nothing hospital, and these kids are going to die because of your limitations." For 3 years, that voice had been her master. It had guided every hesitant decision, every moment of paralyzing self-doubt, every night she'd gone home carrying the weight of imagined failures. Tonight, surrounded by genuine impossibility, it rose to claim her once and for all. The 10-year-old's oxygen saturation was dropping. The spine injury required immediate surgical intervention they couldn't provide. The adult chaperone needed blood they didn't have. 43 patients with injuries that would challenge the Mayo Clinic, and she had Jake, antiquated equipment, and whatever dregs of strength David could still offer. "I can't do this," she whispered, her hands trembling as she reached for the intubation kit. "There are too many, too much damage." That's when she heard it, not David's voice, but another one. Weaker, more distant, but unmistakably familiar. James Morrison's voice carried on the same impossible wind that had brought the mysterious stranger. "You fought for me," the voice said. "When everyone else had given up, you fought for me. 4 more minutes of not being alone, 4 more minutes of someone caring. That mattered, Maggie. It all matters." She looked up to see David pushing himself away from the wall with obvious effort. His carpenter's hands shook as he approached the nearest gurney, but his ancient eyes burned with fierce determination. "I told you I couldn't help with this," he said quietly. "I was wrong. Not about my limitations, those are real, but about yours. David, I can't." "You can." His voice carried echoes of the authority she'd heard throughout the night, but fainter now, like starlight at dawn. "You've been doing it all along. Every patient tonight, every patient for 30 years. You think healing is about preventing death, but it's not. It's about refusing to let suffering go unwitnessed. It's about standing in the space between hope and despair and choosing to act anyway." Maggie felt something crystallize inside her chest, not confidence exactly, but something deeper, acceptance. She couldn't save all 43 patients. The mathematics of rural medicine made that impossible. But she could be fully present for each decision, each procedure, each moment of care. She could refuse to let fear make the choices for her. "Jake," she called, her voice cutting through the chaos with surgical precision. "Set up 3 trauma bays. We're going to work in rotation. Stabilize, move, stabilize. Anyone who can wait gets comfort care until we can get to them." As she moved toward the 10-year-old, Maggie felt the old voice of limitation rising one final time, shrieking its familiar litany of inadequacy and inevitable failure. But now, she had an answer for it. Not the magical intervention she'd witnessed throughout the night, but something more powerful, the simple human refusal to abandon the fight, even when victory was impossible. She intubated the 10-year-old with steady hands, not because she knew the girl would survive, but because this moment deserved her complete attention. She moved to the spine injury, making decisions based on 30 years of accumulated knowledge rather than 3 years of accumulated fear. When the adult chaperone's heart stopped, she performed CPR with the same fierce dedication she'd given James Morrison, not because she could guarantee success, but because the effort itself was sacred. Around her, Jake worked with remarkable efficiency, managing cases that should have been beyond their capabilities. David moved between patients like a whispered prayer, his presence growing fainter but somehow more essential with each passing minute. And through it all, Maggie felt herself becoming who she had always been meant to be, not a savior, not a miracle worker, but a healer who refused to let impossibility dictate the boundaries of care. The confrontation wasn't with the bus crash or the overwhelming injuries or the limitations of rural medicine. It was with the voice that had convinced her she wasn't enough, and as dawn touched the windows of St. Mary's Hospital, that voice finally fell silent, defeated not by miraculous intervention but by the simple human decision to keep fighting anyway. The silence of that defeated voice left space for something Maggie hadn't expected, clarity about what victory would actually cost. She stood over the 10-year-old girl whose breathing had finally stabilized, watching the steady rise and fall of small ribs beneath sterile gauze, and understood with crystalline certainty what she would have to sacrifice. Not her life. That would be too easy, too clean. The cost was something far more precious, the protective shell of limitation she'd built around her heart. For 3 years, her guilt over James Morrison had served a terrible but comforting purpose. It had given her permission to hold back, to doubt herself, to approach each patient with the careful reserve of someone who had already failed once and couldn't risk failing again. The guilt had been her armor against the full weight of caring, against the devastating vulnerability of fighting for lives she might not be able to save. "Maggie!" David's voice was barely a whisper now, his form becoming translucent in the growing dawn light. "You understand what this means, don't you? If you let yourself care completely, for all of them, for every patient who will ever come through those doors, there's no going back to safety." She moved to the teenage boy with the spine injury, her hands steady as she made adjustments to his stabilization. "I know. The pain you felt when James died. You'll feel it again, maybe not this week or this month, but someday. Because this is what it means to be fully human, to love without guarantee, to fight without certainty of victory." Maggie's throat tightened as she recognized the truth of it. The bus crash patients were stabilizing, but there would be others. Terminal diagnoses she couldn't cure, accidents she couldn't prevent, the inevitable losses that came with a lifetime of standing at the intersection of hope and mortality. If she let herself become who she'd been tonight, unarmored, unafraid, completely present, she would feel every one of those losses with the same raw intensity she'd felt with James Morrison. "That's the sacrifice," she said, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "Not just my guilt, but my protection from future grief." Jake appeared at her elbow, exhaustion written in every line of his face. "The last 3 ambulances just radioed in. All stable patients, minor injuries. We did it, Maggie. 43 patients and we didn't lose a single one." The victory should have felt triumphant, but instead it settled over her with the weight of profound responsibility. They had saved everyone tonight, but the cost was the illusion that she could control such outcomes. That holding back, staying small, protecting herself from the full implications of healing could somehow make her more effective. David was barely visible now, more memory than presence, but his ancient eyes held hers with fierce tenderness. "You could stop here," he said. "Go back to being careful. Keep enough distance to protect yourself from the worst of it. No one would blame you." Maggie looked around the emergency department, at the children breathing steadily on gurneys, at families reuniting in tearful embraces, at Jake checking vitals with the careful attention of someone who understood that every heartbeat was a small miracle. Then she looked down at her own hands, still steady after 8 hours of impossible decisions, and realized they had never belonged to her alone. "I can't," she said simply. "These hands, this knowledge, this calling, it was never meant to be held in reserve. James Morrison died knowing he wasn't alone because I was willing to be completely present for his death. These children lived because I was finally willing to be completely present for their healing." The weight of that commitment settled into her bones like lead and light simultaneously. She was choosing to care without limit, to fight without reservation, to open her heart fully to every life that would pass through this hospital for whatever years remained to her. She was choosing to feel every future loss as acutely as she'd felt James Morrison's death, because anything less would be a betrayal of the trust placed in her hands. "The sacrifice isn't just giving up my guilt," she whispered, understanding blooming through her exhaustion. "It's giving up the right to protect myself from what loving this work really costs." David smiled then, the expression barely visible but radiant with approval. "Now you understand what it means to heal," he said, his voice fading with the last shadows of night. "Not the power to prevent death, but the courage to love life completely, knowing how fragile it is." As the first full ray of sunlight streamed through the emergency department windows, Maggie O'Sullivan felt the last of her careful reservations fall away like discarded armor. She had won the battle against impossibility, but the victory required her to remain forever vulnerable to the weight of caring completely. She would never again have the luxury of holding back, of letting fear make her smaller than her calling demanded. It was the most terrifying, most necessary sacrifice she had ever made, and as the mysterious stranger faded completely into memory, she knew she would spend the rest of her career proving herself worthy of its cost. The resolution. Maggie stood in the sudden quiet of the emergency department, her hands still trembling from adrenaline and something deeper, the aftershock of transformation. Around her, the evidence of the impossible night stretched across every surface, 43 patient charts documenting injuries that should have overwhelmed them. Medical equipment pushed beyond its designed limits, and Jake slumped in a chair with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who had witnessed miracles disguised as medicine. The mysterious stranger was gone, not faded or diminished as he had been in those final moments, but completely absent, as if he had never existed at all. Where David had stood offering his quiet guidance, only empty air remained, carrying the faint scent of sawdust that Maggie was already beginning to doubt she had actually smelled. "Did you see where he went?" she asked Jake, her voice hoarse from hours of barked medical orders. Jake looked up with confusion clouding his features. "Where who went?" The question hit Maggie like cold water. She stared at her colleague, the man who had worked beside her all night, who had witnessed every impossible recovery, every moment when David's presence had guided them toward solutions that shouldn't have existed. "The man who helped us," she said slowly. "David. He was here all night, working with the patients." But even as she spoke, she watched understanding drain from Jake's face, replaced by the careful concern of someone watching a colleague approach the edge of exhaustion-induced hallucination. "Maggie, it's been just you and me since the storm hit. You've been carrying this whole thing alone." The words should have shattered something inside her, should have sent her spiraling into doubt about her own sanity. Instead, they settled over her with the strange comfort of recognition. Of course, Jake couldn't remember David. The mysterious stranger had never been meant for anyone else. Only for her, only for this night when she had needed to rediscover who she was beneath 3 years of accumulated fear. She moved through the department, checking on the children who slept peacefully now, their vital signs stable in ways that defied every medical textbook she had ever studied. The 10-year-old girl breathed easily, her punctured lungs somehow sealed and functioning. The boy with the spine injury showed neurological responses that suggested full recovery rather than permanent paralysis. Each patient chart told the same impossible story. Injuries that should have required major trauma centers, miraculously resolved by a night nurse and a resident in a rural hospital with antiquated equipment. "The families are asking questions," Jake said quietly, joining her at the monitoring station, "about how we managed it, about what kind of treatment we provided. The State Medical Board is going to want detailed reports." Maggie nodded, understanding the magnitude of what lay ahead. There would be investigations, interviews, attempts to explain the unexplainable through the rigid language of medical science. She would have to find ways to document miracles using only the vocabulary of charts and procedures and evidence-based medicine. "What are we going to tell them?" Jake asked. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had failed to save James Morrison 3 years ago, that had somehow saved 43 lives tonight. They looked ordinary in the fluorescent hospital lighting, showing no trace of the impossible things they had accomplished. "We'll tell them the truth," she said, "that we used every skill we had, made the best decisions we could with the resources available, and refused to give up on any patient who came through those doors." It wasn't the complete truth, but it was the truth that would fit within the boundaries of acceptable medical reality. The rest, David's presence, the guidance that had come from somewhere beyond her training, the moments when healing had transcended the purely physical, would remain her private knowledge, a secret carried in the space between faith and medicine. The first family members began arriving as the morning shift staff trickled in, their faces etched with the particular terror of parents who had spent the night imagining the worst. Maggie watched reunions unfold across the emergency department. Children embracing mothers with fierce gratitude, fathers weeping over daughters who should have been lost but were somehow whole. She thought of James Morrison then, not with the crushing weight of guilt she had carried for 3 years, but with something approaching peace. He had died alone, except for her presence, but his death had somehow led to this night, to these children who lived because she had finally learned to trust herself completely. "Maggie?" Jake's voice pulled her from her reverie. "The day shift supervisor wants a full briefing, and Dr. Henderson is driving down from Billings to review our procedures." She nodded, already feeling the weight of returning normalcy settling over the hospital like dust after a storm. Soon there would be paperwork and protocols and the careful documentation required by modern medicine. But something fundamental had shifted inside her, something that no amount of bureaucratic scrutiny could touch. For the first time in 3 years, Margaret O'Sullivan felt ready to face whatever came next, carrying the knowledge that healing was not about preventing all loss, but about refusing to let any suffering go unwitnessed. The mysterious stranger was gone, but the transformation he had witnessed, or perhaps enabled, remained, written permanently into the architecture of her courage. The morning briefing room felt surreal after the impossible night. Its harsh fluorescent lights and institutional beige walls, a jarring return to the mundane world of protocols and procedures. Maggie sat across from Dr. Henderson, watching him flip through chart after chart with increasing bewilderment, his pen hovering over forms that demanded explanations she couldn't provide in any language medical science would accept. 43 patients, Dr. Henderson repeated for the 3rd time, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone trying to make sense of impossibility. Multiple trauma cases that should have required immediate transfer to Billings. "And you're telling me you lost no one?" "Not a single patient," Jake confirmed, exhaustion making his voice flat. Maggie coordinated everything. "I've never seen medicine practiced like that." Maggie felt a familiar flutter of panic at the praise, but it died quickly, replaced by something steadier. She met Dr. Henderson's questioning gaze without flinching. "We used everything we had, made decisions based on 30 years of emergency medicine experience. Sometimes that's enough." But even as she spoke the approved words, she felt the transformation David had witnessed settling deeper into her bones. 3 years ago, James Morrison's death had convinced her she wasn't enough, not skilled enough, not strong enough, not worthy of the trust placed in her hands. Now she understood that being enough had never been about preventing every loss. It was about showing up completely, without reservation, for whatever came through those doors. Dr. Henderson closed the last chart and leaned back in his chair. "The State Medical Board is going to want detailed documentation. This kind of success rate with these injuries, it's unprecedented for a facility our size." "I understand," Maggie said, and she did. There would be scrutiny, questions, attempts to replicate what couldn't be replicated because it had never been about technique alone, but she no longer felt the old fear of being found inadequate. Let them examine every decision, every procedure. What mattered was that 43 families had been reunited, 43 children would grow up to see tomorrow. After the briefing, Maggie found herself in the hospital chapel, a small room she hadn't entered since James Morrison's death. The wooden cross above the altar was simple, unremarkable, nothing like the worn piece David had left behind, if he had ever existed at all. Doubt flickered at the edges of her memory, but she pushed it aside. Whether David had been real or a manifestation of her own desperate need to rediscover her calling didn't matter. What mattered was who she had become in his presence. "Maggie?" She turned to find Father McKenna in the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern. "I heard about the bus accident. Jake told me what you did. I just did my job." The words felt inadequate, but they were true in a way that transcended the miraculous aspects of the night. "Your job," Father McKenna repeated, settling into the pew beside her. "For 3 years you've been coming to my office, carrying guilt like stones in your pockets. Tonight you saved 43 lives. Do you see the connection?" Maggie thought of James Morrison, of the 4 extra minutes she'd given him, of how that failure had somehow prepared her for this success. "He died so I could learn something about letting go, about trusting myself even when I can't control the outcome. Or maybe," Father McKenna said gently, "he died because sometimes that's what happens, and you learn to live with uncertainty without letting it make you smaller." The chapel fell quiet, except for the distant sounds of the hospital waking up to a normal day. Maggie felt the weight of her transformation settling into something permanent, something she could carry back into the ordinary world of routine cases and predictable challenges. She was no longer the nurse who had failed James Morrison, but she wasn't the woman who had worked miracles either. She was something in between, someone who had learned to practice medicine without the armor of controlled outcomes, someone willing to care completely despite the inevitable future losses. When she finally returned to the emergency department, the morning shift was in full swing, handling the usual collection of winter ailments and minor injuries. Everything looked exactly as it had before the storm, before the bus crash, before David's impossible presence had reminded her who she was meant to be. Jake was finishing his charts at the nurse's station, dark circles under his eyes, but something lighter in his expression. "You heading home?" he asked. Maggie looked around the department one last time, seeing it not as the place where she had failed 3 years ago, but as the place where she had learned to succeed without guarantee. Tomorrow night she would return for another shift, and there would be patients who needed her complete attention, her willingness to fight impossible odds, her refusal to let any suffering go unwitnessed. "Yeah," she said, gathering her coat, "I'm going home." But as she walked toward the exit, Maggie knew she was carrying something new with her, not the weight of old guilt, but the courage to love her calling completely, whatever it might cost her. She had returned to her world transformed, ready to practice the kind of medicine that honored both human limitation and the mysterious grace that sometimes transcended it. The drive home through the quiet Montana morning felt like a journey between worlds. Maggie's truck moved through streets where snowplows had already cleared the evidence of the storm, past houses where families were waking up to ordinary Tuesdays, unaware that miracles had been worked in the darkness while they slept. The radio played soft Christmas carols. Christmas Eve was only 2 weeks away, she realized with a start. 3 years ago, that date had marked the beginning of her descent into guilt and self-doubt. Now it approached like any other day on the calendar, drained of its power to wound her. At home, her small farmhouse sat exactly as she'd left it 12 hours earlier, but everything felt different through her transformed eyes. The kitchen where she'd eaten countless solitary dinners, the living room where she'd replayed James Morrison's death every night for 3 years, the bedroom where she'd lain awake wrestling with inadequacy, all of it looked smaller now, as if her expanded understanding of her own capacity had outgrown the confines of her old life. She showered and fell into bed as the sun climbed higher, but sleep brought dreams of ancient eyes and carpenter's hands, of children breathing steadily in hospital beds, of James Morrison smiling as he faded into whatever came after. When she woke at sunset, the dreams felt more real than the quiet house around her. Days passed into weeks, and Maggie settled into what she came to think of as her new normal. She returned to St. Mary's each night carrying the transformation like a new set of surgical instruments, invisible to others but essential to her work. The emergency department saw its usual parade of winter injuries, seasonal flu, and the occasional serious trauma that tested her skills without requiring miracles. Each case received her complete attention, her willingness to fight impossible odds, her refusal to let any suffering go unwitnessed. The State Medical Board completed their investigation with grudging acceptance of her documentation. 43 successful outcomes in a single shift became a case study in rural emergency medicine, though Maggie smiled reading the sanitized reports that reduced that impossible night to exceptional clinical judgment under extreme conditions. Let them explain it however they needed to. The families whose children came home whole didn't need to understand the mechanism of grace. On Christmas Eve, Maggie found herself standing in room 7 where James Morrison had died, now occupied by an elderly rancher recovering from chest pains that had turned out to be severe heartburn. She'd treated him with the same intense focus she brought to every patient now, but without the desperate edge that had marked her work for 3 years. When his wife arrived with tears of relief, Maggie felt the familiar ache of caring completely, but it no longer threatened to break her. "You saved my Bill," the woman said, gripping Maggie's hands with fierce gratitude. "I just did what I could," Maggie replied, and meant it. She hadn't saved him from mortality or the inevitable losses that would come with age. She had simply been completely present for this moment when presence was enough. As her shift ended that Christmas morning, Maggie walked through the hospital corridors where she'd spent most of her adult life, seeing them with eyes that no longer feared failure because they finally understood the difference between failing and being human. In the chapel, she lit a candle for James Morrison, not in guilt anymore, but in gratitude for the hard lesson his death had taught her about the courage required to love her calling completely. Father McKenna found her there. "How are you, Maggie?" "Different," she said, watching the candle flame dance. "Ready?" Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, and Maggie thought of the mysterious stranger whose presence had reminded her who she was meant to be. Whether David had been divine intervention, exhaustion-induced hallucination, or something between faith and medicine that defied categories didn't matter. What mattered was the nurse she had become in his presence, someone willing to practice medicine without armor, to care without reservation, to show up completely for whatever walked through those emergency room doors. She drove home through the falling snow, knowing that tomorrow night she would return to St. Mary's and do it all again. There would be patients she could save and patients she couldn't, victories that filled her with joy and losses that would break her heart. But she would meet each case with everything she had, holding nothing back, trusting that her hands and knowledge and willingness to love her work completely were exactly what they were meant to be. In her rearview mirror, the hospital faded into the distance, but the transformation it had witnessed remained, written permanently into the architecture of her courage. Margaret O'Sullivan had learned to heal without guarantee, to care without limit, and to find peace in the space between human limitation and divine grace. The road ahead stretched clear and bright with possibility.